In this section of the lecture, I'm going to be talking about the rise of the Atlantic traders. Adam Smith famously declared that the discovery of America and that of a passage to the East Indies by the Cape of Good Hope are the two greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind. And while that may be something of an exaggeration, they are certainly exceptionally important events in the history of economic development. In the 2 centuries after Christopher Columbus's voyage, Europe expanded its capacity to travel the globe and to have contact with peoples in other parts of the globe. This established a link between what are often referred to as the Old World and the New World, and it was to have significant consequences for both populations in the New World and Old World. There are 3 voyages that are often in particular identified as opening up the world to the Atlantic traders in Europe. There was Columbus's voyage to the Americas in 1492. Then there was Da Gama's voyage around the Cape of Good Hope to India and back again, which took place in 1497 to 1499. And then finally there was Ferdinand Magellan, and after his death, de Cano's voyage around Cape Horn, and then back through Indies and around back to Europe, circumnavigating the globe. So this was a period of history when knowledge about other lands and knowledge of how to travel to those other lands expanded rapidly. As William Bernstein puts it in his book, A Splendid Exchange, Spanish and Dutch mariners had decoded the last great secrets of the planetary wind machine, allowing them to cross vast expanses of the world's oceans with relative ease. Once European nations had this knowledge, the capacity to travel was enhanced by 2 developments. First of all, there were improvements in this period in shipping technology, both in the hardware and software. So the types of ships that were available improved. For example, there were developments such as the Dutch flute ship, which was a ship that required half the amount of labour of previous vessels, and there were also improvements in sail technology. The software was improvements in navigation that allowed the ships to travel more efficiently between locations. Another development during this period was an improvement in institutions. So Douglas North, who studied the period from 1600 to 1850, drew the conclusion that a major reason for the expansion in international trade and sea travel during this period was the decline of piracy and privateering, and also the development of more sophisticated markets for international trade. So there was the knowledge of other lands, there was the shipping to allow travel to those other lands, and there was the institutional setting to facilitate travel to those other lands. Having made the discoveries of the new lands, Europe's primary motivation for travelling to those new lands was to increase national wealth. This was a period that's often referred to as mercantilist period, where wealth and economic power were sought in order to increase state power. The idea being, with more wealth and economic power, government revenue would be higher, and that would allow greater military expenditure, which would increase state power. Greater state power could then be used in the service of increasing national wealth and economic power. As Ron Finlay and Kevin O'Rourke write in their paper on commodity market integration, government policy during this age of mercantilism was geared to the active promotion of positive trade balances by the establishment of chartered monopolies, by the acquisition of overseas colonies as sources of raw materials and profitable re-exports, and as markets for manufactures from the mother country. The power of the state, primarily naval, was used to obtain plenty through trade, which could then be taxed to finance the sources of power. As the economic historian Carlo Kippel puts it, religion supplied the pretext and gold the motive. The technological progress, guns and sails, accomplished by Atlantic Europe during the 14th and 15th century provided the means. So Kipler in this quote is affirming the idea that the motivation for travel by these European nations was gold, increasing national wealth. He's pointing out that the reason why European nations were able to become dominant over the countries that they went to trade with, often expropriate wealth from, was that they had superior technology to those countries in the New World that they were travelling to, guns and sails. This is a theme, for example, also in the work of Jared Diamond, whose well-known book, Guns, Germs and Steel, expresses the idea that the reason Europe became dominant over the rest of the world in this period was because of its technological advantage. That technological advantage being based on faster rate of industrialisation and urbanisation because of geographic advantages that Europe had, a higher stock of domesticable plants and animals, and being located on an east-west axis which facilitated the transfer of knowledge. Now, the rise of the Atlantic traders took place over an extended period, and so there's a story within a story that I'm going to tell in the rest of this section of the lecture. It's possible to give an approximate chronology of naval dominance during this period. In the 16th century, it was Portugal and Spain who were the dominant naval powers. In the 17th century and the early 18th century, it was the Netherlands. And from the late 17th century and 18th century onwards, it was England that was the dominant naval power. You can get some sense of this from this graph, which shows the number of ships departing from countries in Europe from 1500 through to the late 18th century. You can see that this line, which shows Portugal, is showing Portugal to have been the main naval power in the 16th century. Then, in the 17th century, sort of through to the 18th century, we have voyages from the Netherlands. Then we have voyages from England becoming relatively more important in the late 17th century and 18th century. Now, this graph is just for ships departing to Asia, and so the reason Spain's not in there is that, as we'll talk about in just a minute, Spain's part of the world was not Asia. But this is at least giving you a feel for Portugal's role early, then the Netherlands, and then England becoming increasingly important. The transfer of naval dominance is also associated with dominance in income per capita. So here I've shown output per capita, GDP per capita, for the three countries, Spain, Netherlands and the United Kingdom, from 1300 through to 1850. And so you can see that for the period when the Spanish were the dominant naval power, their output per capita is higher than the Netherlands or England. In the period when the Netherlands is the dominant naval power, it's the richest country in the world. And then in the period when England comes to be, the United Kingdom comes to be the dominant naval power, it becomes the richest country in the world. Now, we have to be a little bit careful about what conclusions we draw from this, because of course a country could be rich because of its naval dominance, but of course being rich also allowed it to spend more on its navy, which meant that it would have the dominant navy at that time. But nevertheless, it's a nice way of seeing that there's a definite association between economic well-being in a country and the extent of naval dominance historically. What I'm going to do now is move on and say a little bit more about each of the phases when Spain and Portugal and the Netherlands and then England were the dominant naval power. In doing that, it's important to make the point that I am focusing on the naval powers, that during this time there continued to be other countries that were extremely important in terms of world trade. For example, the Ottoman Turks and the Chinese are still very much involved in world trade during this period of time. The other thing I have to say is that passing of the baton was not a bloodless process, that during this period there was a huge amount of warfare and fighting between the different powers as they tried to establish naval supremacy. That's something that I'm going to gloss over. So the first era of the rise of the Atlantic traders was the period associated with the dominance of Spain and Portugal. And that was obviously associated with the voyages of people like Columbus and da Gama and Magellan. In 1494, Portugal and Spain agreed to divide up the world using the Tordesillas line. This was an agreement that essentially gave Asia to Portugal and gave the Americas, the New World, to Spain. So that's why when we saw the graph on the number of ships, there were lots of ships from Portugal to Asia, but none from Spain to Asia, because Asia wasn't Spain's part of the world. International trade between Spain and Portugal and the areas they were trading with was initially in the form of high value, low weight commodities. This was because it was expensive to transport and ship goods at that time. And so it was things like spices, peppers and silver that were the goods that were primarily transported back to Europe from the regions that Spain and Portugal were trading with. And they tended to be goods that are what we call non-competing with goods in Europe. So they were goods that weren't produced in Europe. And for that reason, they achieved high prices for sale back in Europe. The second phase of the rise of the Atlantic traders was the period of dominance of the Dutch. So in 1560, northern Dutch provinces revolt from Spain, and in 1579 they established the Treaty of Utrecht. Fighting between the Dutch and Spanish continues through to the sort of mid-17th century, but the power of the Spanish economy is weakening in the late 16th, early 17th century because of inflation and a crisis in government's fiscal position. And so this becomes the golden age of the Dutch economy, where the Dutch are the richest economy in the world. There was a variety of factors underpinning the Dutch economic success. One is that the Dutch had a high level of agricultural productivity, so they'd engaged in activities like land reclamation, and they focused their production on high productivity agricultural activities such as livestock and dairy farming. The Dutch were also a productive manufacturing country during this period, so they had established leading technology for the manufacture of the new draperies. They also had close access to Spanish supplies of wool. The Dutch came to naval dominance through factors such as improvements in shipping technology, for example their flute ship, and their geographic location. So they were well positioned between the Baltic countries, which were supplying wheat to the rest of Europe, and ports such as Lisbon, who were wanting to have wheat transported to them. So the Dutch were sort of a port through which transport could occur. They were also able to leverage their naval advantage into an advantage in the supply of commercial and trade services. And so they developed new financial instruments, they developed new methods of corporate organisation, they developed such as the Dutch East India Company, which became the Dutch company for undertaking international trade, and they developed new methods of risk sharing. And through developing in this way, they attracted capital, so the Dutch capital markets became the large capital markets, interest rates became low, and the success of capital markets then became a feature that fed into further success of the Dutch economy. In this graph, I've shown something about the nature of imports from the Dutch East India Company into Europe from the early 17th to the late 18th century. You can see the point I made earlier that sort of initially in the 17th century, goods like pepper, low weight, high value commodities are extremely important, also other spices, but that as time goes on, we see imports of textiles becoming increasingly important, and also sort of in the 18th century, tea and coffee become very important as imports to Europe as well. The third phase in the rise of the Atlantic traders is the period of English dominance from the 17th century, late 17th century onwards. England was frozen out of the East Indies, and so they sought to develop new trading relationships with China, India, and in the Caribbean. Important in England's rise to naval power was their rise as a military power. In the mid-17th century, they fought the Anglo-Dutch Wars, and then they were fighting against the French through to the middle of the 18th century. During the 100 years before the middle of the 18th century, the size of the English Navy and Army had trebled. Another important aspect of English rise to dominance was institutional developments. So like the Dutch, the English had a monopoly company, the East India Company, through which international trade was required to occur. The Navigation Acts of 1651 and 1660 required that all imports to England should be brought in either in English ships or in ships from the country from which the goods were being imported, thereby giving English shipping a huge advantage in international trade with England. By the 1770s, exports accounted for 9% of English GDP. In this slide, I've got some information about what the composition of English exports was at this time. So you can see if we look in total, exports were made up of about half manufactures, primarily woolen textiles and metalware, and also what are called re-exports are very important. Re-exports is where goods that were imported to Britain were then exported on from Britain to, for example, we can see here, primarily other parts of Europe. It's also possible to gain a perspective on English imports at this time. We can see English imports were primarily of foodstuffs, most of those foodstuffs coming from Asia, Africa and America, and the foodstuffs predominantly being made up of sugar, tea and coffee. In fact, sugar, tea, coffee and tobacco make up over 3/5 of this 50% of foodstuffs. The other important import to England during this period was raw materials, much of which were textile related or dyes. Interestingly, the biggest proportion of these imports came from Europe. Sometimes it's said that in this period, before the Industrial Revolution, there was a triangular pattern of trade that England was involved in. That England supplied manufactured goods to Africa, Africa provided slaves to the Americas, and the Americas provided foodstuffs and raw materials to England. But we can see from the data on the last couple of slides that in fact the pattern of trade really also involved a significant amount of exports and imports to the rest of Europe. I've split this material on the rise of the Atlantic traders into two parts. In the next part, I'm going to come back and talk about the consequences of the increased contact between the Old World and the New World for the populations in both regions.